Some of the 64 battleships constructed by the U.S. Navy during the 20th century have achieved near-mythic status. Names like USS Maine, USS Arizona, and USS Missouri are etched forever in the collective memory of history. They became symbols of tragedy, victory, and the immense industrial and human power of the American fleet. Yet, for every ship that earned immortality in textbooks and museums, there were many others that quietly served their nation with equal dedication but far less recognition. Among these unsung steel giants stood the USS South Dakota, BB-57, a battleship that never basked in the glare of headlines, yet whose officers and crew performed their duties with steadfast courage from 1942 to the war's end. Their efforts, though less celebrated, were vital threads in the grand tapestry of Allied victory. The South Dakota's story began in the tense years before America's entry into World War II. In 1936, when Japan withdrew from the restrictions imposed by the 1931 Naval Limitation Treaty, it sent shockwaves through the naval world. The U.S. Navy, sensing the growing threat across the Pacific, invoked the expansion clause of that treaty to begin designing a new generation of battleships. What emerged were three revolutionary classes: the North Carolina class, the South Dakota class, and the Iowa class, each pushing the limits of naval architecture, firepower, and speed. The USS South Dakota, the lead ship of her class, was constructed at the New York Shipbuilding Corporation and launched on June 7, 1941, just 6 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Fully loaded, she displaced around 45,000 tons and stretched 680 feet in length. Though not the largest of the Navy's new dreadnoughts, she carried a formidable punch. Her primary armament, 9 16-inch, .45 caliber Mark VI guns mounted in 3 turrets, could unleash a devastating broadside, hurling 9 tons of shells toward a target nearly 37,000 yards away, far beyond the horizon. She was engineered for speed, efficiency, and long-range lethality, a perfect blend of power and precision. What made the South Dakota class truly cutting-edge, however, was its technological sophistication. She was equipped with SK air search radar and SD surface search radar, systems that gave her an enormous tactical advantage over Japanese ships, which at that stage of the war still lacked radar capability. Her Mark III fire control system for the main battery and Mark IV system for secondary guns made her one of the most accurate battleships afloat. In the words of naval historians, these fast battleships represented a tremendous leap forward in technology, orders of magnitude over the old battleships, even those that had been modernized. They combined speed, advanced fire control, and fuel efficiency, consuming nearly a third less fuel than their pre-war predecessors. Following her shakedown and initial trials, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Ernest King ordered the newly commissioned USS South Dakota to the Pacific in August 1942 to reinforce the American fleet supporting the Marines on Guadalcanal. She was assigned to Battleship Division 6, BAT Div 6, under Rear Admiral Willis Chingley, who made her his flagship. The division included USS Washington and the light anti-aircraft cruiser USS Juneau, forming a potent task force ready to challenge Japan's naval dominance in the Solomon Islands. On September 6, 1942, the ships of BAT Div 6 arrived at Tongatabu, ready to join the fight. But fate intervened almost immediately. As the group weighed anchor to depart for the Solomons, disaster struck. Relying on outdated nautical charts, Captain Thomas L. Gatch, South Dakota's commanding officer, inadvertently ran the massive battleship aground on a coral reef. The collision ripped an 18-inch gash along the length of her hull, a serious wound for a ship meant for war. In less than 4 hours, the pride of the division was forced to limp back to port. With her hull damaged and machinery strained, the South Dakota was ordered back to Pearl Harbor for urgent repairs, accompanied by the USS Atlanta and USS Saratoga, which had been torpedoed days earlier by the Japanese submarine I-26. The grounding was a humiliating setback for both the ship and the Navy. Her absence for the next 3 weeks deprived Admiral Lee of a vital component of his new fast battleship force at a time when every gun and every ship counted in the desperate struggle for Guadalcanal. Though her war would soon see redemption and glory, the USS South Dakota's first chapter was a humbling reminder that even the most advanced warships were not immune to human error and the unforgiving nature of the sea. It was an inauspicious beginning for a vessel destined to become one of the most battle-hardened American battleships of the Pacific War. When the USS South Dakota finally reached the waters off Guadalcanal in October 1942, she joined Task Force 16 under the legendary Admiral William F. Halsey, the same Bull Halsey whose aggressive leadership embodied the new fighting spirit of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific. The long-anticipated moment had arrived. The brand-new battleship was about to enter combat for the first time. Her baptism of fire came swiftly and violently during the Battle of Santa Cruz on October 26, 1942, one of the most savage carrier battles of the war. Although her massive 16-inch main guns never fired during the engagement, the South Dakota's contribution was far from minor. She became a floating fortress of anti-aircraft fire, her decks bristling with a forest of 20mm Oerlikons, 40mm Bofors, and 5-inch dual-purpose guns, all roaring in unison as wave after wave of Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes descended upon Task Force 16. Her gunners unleashed a deadly wall of steel, filling the sky with black puffs of flak and red tracer streaks that cut through the tropical haze. The Japanese Val dive bombers and Kate torpedo planes swarmed toward the USS Enterprise, determined to finish what they had started at Pearl Harbor. The Kates missed South Dakota, but the Vals managed to score a hit when a single bomb struck the ship's forward turret, though it miraculously failed to penetrate the thick armor. The explosion wounded Captain Thomas L. Gatch, who had been directing the ship's defense from the open bridge, and tore deep gouges into two of the No. 2 turret's massive 16-inch guns, rendering them useless until they could be replaced. The ship shook violently, her decks littered with shrapnel and twisted metal, yet her crew held firm, continuing to pour fire into the attacking squadrons. Nearby, tragedy struck the destroyer USS Smith. A damaged Kate torpedo bomber, engulfed in flames, crashed directly onto her foredeck, igniting a massive inferno. In a desperate act of seamanship and courage, Lieutenant Commander Hunter Wood, the Smith's captain, steered his burning ship in behind South Dakota, whose great hull was cutting through the ocean at full speed toward the Enterprise. The spray from the battleship's wake cascaded over the destroyer's bow, smothering the raging fires, a moment of instinctive heroism that saved the Smith and her crew. The battle ended in bitter loss and grim survival. Enterprise suffered heavy damage, and her sister carrier Hornet was battered beyond repair and ultimately scuttled to prevent capture. On October 27, as the battered remnants of Task Force 16 steamed toward Noumea, New Caledonia, a lurking Japanese submarine was detected nearby, forcing the fleet into sudden evasive maneuvers. In the ensuing confusion, South Dakota collided with the destroyer USS Mahan. The smaller ship's bow was crushed, forcing her to return to Hawaii for major repairs, while South Dakota, though damaged, managed to limp into Noumea, where temporary repairs were completed by November 6. Once patched up, Admiral Halsey ordered South Dakota to rejoin Admiral Willis Lee's Battleship Division 6, consisting of USS Washington, the heavy cruiser Northampton, and 9 destroyers. Together, they were tasked with protecting the now lone operational carrier in the South Pacific Enterprise and intercepting a powerful Japanese task force reported to be moving toward Guadalcanal to bombard Henderson Field, the airfield that had become the key to the entire campaign. On November 14, off Savo Island, Lee's force prepared for battle against Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo's formidable fleet, which included the battleship Kirishima, 2 heavy cruisers, and a destroyer screen. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft spotted the American ships but misidentified them as cruisers and destroyers, leading Kondo to underestimate his opponent's strength, a mistake that would soon prove fatal. When the 2 fleets finally made contact that night, the sea erupted in chaos. Both Washington and South Dakota had minimal experience using their main batteries in combat, and neither had undergone proper training for night fighting. At 2,317 hours, Washington opened fire, her 16-inch guns thundering under radar direction. Moments later, South Dakota joined in, targeting 2 of Kondo's destroyers. Her gunners believed they had sunk both, but in reality, their shells fell wide. To make matters worse, 2 of her forward guns were still disabled from earlier damage, limiting her firepower. Then, disaster struck. At 2,330 hours, A short circuit in her main electrical panel crippled the ship's radar and fire control systems, leaving her effectively blind in the darkness. Worse still, the glow of two burning American destroyers nearby silhouetted South Dakota, turning her into an illuminated target against the Black Sea. The Japanese gunners did not miss their chance. At 2,340 hours, South Dakota fired her aft turrets, but the first salvo set fire to her own Kingfisher scout planes on the quarterdeck. The next salvo blew the burning aircraft overboard, but the shock again disrupted her electrical circuits, plunging the battleship into another 5 minutes of confusion. When her radar came back online, it picked up the ominous blip of Kirishima and her two escorting cruisers closing in. Following Japanese night fighting doctrine, Kondo's ships launched a spread of torpedoes, all of which missed their mark. But his surface gunners found their range. At point-blank distance, barely 5,000 yards, South Dakota was hammered mercilessly. She took 26 hits from 8-inch cruiser shells and a single 14-inch shell from Kirishima, tearing into her superstructure, wrecking radar equipment, and wounding scores of men. The once pristine battleship was now a smoking, battered silhouette, but she refused to die. While South Dakota absorbed this brutal punishment, effectively becoming Kondo's whipping boy, her sister ship Washington remained undetected. Using her radar-directed fire, Washington unleashed a devastating series of 16-inch salvos at Kirishima, scoring multiple direct hits. Within minutes, the Japanese battleship was burning fiercely, her steering jammed, her hull fatally ruptured. As Kondo's fleet fired one last, futile spread of torpedoes, he ordered a retreat. By dawn, Kirishima had capsized and sunk beneath the dark waters off Savo Island. The Second Battle of Guadalcanal was over. The price for South Dakota had been heavy, 40 crewmen dead, 140 wounded, and her upper deck scarred and twisted by shellfire, but her stand had allowed Washington to deliver the killing blows that turned the tide. For her valor and sacrifice in one of the most chaotic and close-quarters battles ever fought between battleships, USS South Dakota was awarded the Navy Unit Commendation. Though her decks were bloodied and her armor pitted, the ship and her crew had proven their worth. From that night forward, South Dakota was no longer just another new battleship. She had earned her place among the warriors of the Pacific. At Noumea, the USS South Dakota, BB-57, tied up alongside the repair ship Prometheus to patch up the heavy damage she had suffered during the fierce night battle off Guadalcanal. Though her crew had hoped to return to the Solomons, fate had other plans. By November 29th, she was ordered to head back across the Pacific through the Panama Canal and onward to New York for an extended refit and reassignment to the Atlantic Fleet. Upon her arrival at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, the weary but battle-hardened ship was placed in dry dock for major repairs and modernization. Interestingly, back home, she was hailed as a national hero. The press mistakenly credited her with single-handedly winning the naval battle of Guadalcanal. To maintain operational secrecy, she was given the now famous code name Battleship X, a title that soon became legendary across America. By early 1943, Captain Thomas L. Gatch, who had heroically commanded her through some of the toughest months of the war, was relieved by Captain Lynn D. McCormick. Under his leadership, South Dakota was assigned to the North Atlantic, joining her sister ship Alabama and the Carrier Ranger to form part of a powerful escort group protecting Arctic convoys bound for the Soviet port of Murmansk. For 3 long months, South Dakota and her task force braved some of the harshest seas and coldest conditions on Earth, working alongside British Royal Navy warships to ensure the vital supply lines to Russia remained open. By August 1943, the ship returned to Norfolk for a short overhaul. Soon after, as part of Battleship Division 9 under Admiral Edward Hanson, South Dakota again set course for the Pacific. She arrived at Fiji in November and was immediately thrust into the island-hopping campaign. Her first assignment, the pre-invasion bombardment of Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands. As her massive 16-inch guns roared, flattening Japanese defenses, the crew felt their ship had finally shed the bad luck reputation that had followed her since Guadalcanal. After Tarawa's capture, South Dakota joined Admiral Willis Lee's battle group to bombard Nauru, an operation that met little resistance but demonstrated the overwhelming power of the new U.S. Navy fleet. Next came Operation Flintlock, the monumental assault on the Marshall Islands. Under Admiral Raymond Spruance, the U.S. 5th and 3rd Fleets assembled one of the most formidable armadas in history: 12 carriers, 8 battleships, 20 cruisers, 100 destroyers, nearly 1,000 aircraft, and 2 divisions of ground troops. Their objectives included the heavily defended islands of Kwajalein, Roina Mor, Majuro, and Uatak, Jalawat, and Mealy. For South Dakota and her crew, this was the campaign that truly defined their service, a vast coordinated strike that pushed Japan's defensive perimeter westward. After the Marshalls, the next target was Truk, the great Japanese naval stronghold in the Caroline Islands. American carriers and battleships launched devastating air and surface attacks that sank or crippled a large part of Japan's remaining support fleet. South Dakota, accompanied by 2 other battleships, also pounded Pohnpei in late April before joining a new task group of 9 battleships and 4 heavy cruisers escorting carriers during the invasion of the Marianas. Here, the battleships took on a new role serving as anti-aircraft guardians for the fast carrier task force. When Admirals Lee and Mark Mitcher met to discuss tactics, they decided that the big battleships should remain close to the carriers, using their radar and thick anti-aircraft batteries to shield the fleet from air assault. On June 19, during the massive Battle of the Philippine Sea, South Dakota's radar was the first to detect the incoming Japanese strike force. Moments later, waves of enemy bombers attacked. Despite taking a bomb hit that blasted a 12-foot hole in her steel deck, South Dakota remained in action, her gunners filling the sky with deadly flak. For 2 relentless days, her crew fought off repeated air raids as American carrier planes annihilated Japan's naval aviation, an engagement later known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. As the war pressed closer to Japan, South Dakota took part in bombardments of Formosa and Okinawa before joining Task Force 34 under Rear Admiral Forrest Sherman. During the massive Battle of Leyte Gulf, she supported the landings on the Philippine island of Leyte, and later moved north to protect the fast carriers chasing a Japanese decoy force. In early November, she delivered powerful shore bombardments to aid ground troops on both Leyte and Luzon. Much of her time between battles was spent refueling destroyers at sea, a routine but crucial task for maintaining the fleet's forward operations. When Admiral Spruance took command of the 5th Fleet, South Dakota became part of Task Force 58, the fast carrier and battleship strike force that carried the war deep into Japanese waters. During the invasion of Iwo Jima, she and the other battleships steamed north to shell military and industrial targets on Japan's home islands. Bad weather often forced operations to be postponed, but whenever the skies cleared, South Dakota's mighty guns spoke again, pounding southern Kyushu, the Kure Naval Base, and numerous airfields. With each operation, she brought the Allies one step closer to victory. From the icy seas of Murmansk to the burning skies over the Pacific, the once troubled Battleship X had finally cemented her legacy as one of the most resilient and battle-hardened warships of World War II. After several months of relentless operations across the Pacific, the USS South Dakota and the other battleships of Admiral Lee's division refueled at the great forward anchorage of Ulithi. The fleet was preparing for one of the most ambitious and bloodiest operations of the entire Pacific War, the invasion of Okinawa. As March turned into April 1945, South Dakota joined the massive bombardment force that would soften Japanese defenses ahead of the amphibious landings. The war was now creeping ever closer to Japan itself, and every sailor aboard knew that each mission brought them deeper into the enemy's final defensive ring. For the crew of South Dakota, the campaign also felt like a chance for redemption. The ship's reputation for bad luck earned through collisions, electrical failures, and combat damage seemed to have finally lifted. But as fate would have it, the battleship still had one last brush with disaster waiting on the horizon. By this time, South Dakota was under the command of Captain Charles Bowers Swede Mommsen, a man already legendary within the Navy. Mommsen was not your typical battleship captain. He had made his name as a daring and innovative submariner, pioneering deep-sea rescue techniques and developing the famous Mommsen lung, a device that saved countless submariners' lives. His restless energy and brilliant engineering mind had earned him a special distinction in command of a frontline capital ship. To some, it seemed unusual to place a submariner in charge of one of the Navy's most powerful surface warships, but to those who knew Mommsen, it made perfect sense. He was a man who thrived in crisis, and his calm under pressure would soon be tested in the most dramatic way imaginable. During the Okinawa campaign, South Dakota spent weeks alternating between shore bombardment missions and replenishment runs offshore. The fighting on the island was fierce and unrelenting. Each day, her 9 16-inch guns hurled tons of high-explosive shells into the Japanese positions, tearing apart caves, bunkers, and artillery sites. On May 6, 1945, Captain Mommsen stood on the bridge, watching as the great rifles of his ship unleashed another thunderous barrage against the enemy on southern Okinawa. The rhythmic crash of the guns shook the deck and reverberated through the hull, a familiar and oddly reassuring sound to a crew that had been at war for years. When the magazines began to run low, Mommsen gave the order to cease fire and move offshore to replenish ammunition. Out at sea, the ammunition ship USS Wrangel came alongside, and the meticulous process of rearming began. Cranes hoisted massive 16-inch shells, each weighing over a ton, and long silk-wrapped powder bags into waiting chutes that carried them deep below deck into the battleship's magazines. Everything was proceeding smoothly, the crew moving with quiet efficiency. Then, without warning, a dense cloud of dirty yellow smoke burst from the vents near turret number 2. For a few tense seconds, no one moved. Then came a deep, gut-wrenching roar followed by a heavy, muffled explosion that made the entire 45,000-ton ship tremble violently. Captain Mommsen froze for only a heartbeat before realizing the dreadful truth. The forward magazines were exploding. Hundreds of tons of propellant, enough to blow the ship apart, were stored just below that turret. If the fire spread, South Dakota could be obliterated in an instant, taking every soul aboard with her. Without hesitation, Mommsen lunged for the 1MC intercom. His voice, calm but urgent, echoed through every compartment. "Flood the magazines for number 2 turret." Down below, sailors raced to obey the command. But on the bridge, there was nothing more the captain could do but wait. Outside, the sea churned as nearby ships hastily backed away from the stricken battleship, fearing a catastrophic detonation. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning powder. Moments later, a second explosion thundered through the ship, followed by 3 more in quick succession. Each blast rocked the massive vessel from stem to stern, sending shudders through the steel deck and rattling every bulkhead. Men clung to their stations, waiting for the next blast that might tear the ship apart. Just then, Rear Admiral Willis Lee burst onto the bridge, his face pale and eyes wide with alarm. "For Christ's sake, Swede!" he shouted over the noise. "What in the hell is happening?" A quartermaster standing at the helm later recalled the scene in vivid detail. Mommsen never turned his gaze from the forward turret, where thick yellow smoke still poured skyward in pulsing bursts. His voice, though steady, carried a grim finality as he answered, "Admiral, I believe the forward magazines are exploding." Lee, a battle-hardened commander who had faced Japanese battleships at point-blank range, was momentarily stunned. "Good God, man, what are you doing about it?" he demanded. Mommsen, still calm amid the chaos, replied evenly, "I have ordered the magazines flooded." Lee's eyes darted toward the damage control crew, his voice rising in desperation. "Well, is it being done?" No one on the bridge could answer for certain. The intercom crackled with half-heard reports from below, and each new tremor felt like it could be the one that would split the great ship apart. Yet through it all, Mommsen remained composed, his steady presence holding the crew together as they fought for their lives against the inferno raging within their own steel citadel. Mommsen never took his eyes off the towering mass of steel that was turret number 2. Smoke still poured from its vents in rhythmic bursts, each one carrying the acrid stench of burnt powder. His voice, though calm, carried a quiet resignation as he turned to Admiral Lee and said, "I hope so, Admiral. But I'm not going to call them now to find out. Anyway, we'll know soon enough." He then raised his hand, pointing toward the sky, and added in a steady tone that sent chills through everyone on the bridge, "If they are not, that's where we will be in about 30 seconds." For a long tense moment, The only sounds were the distant crackle of fires and the low hum of the ship's machinery. The men on the bridge stood silently, each one acutely aware that their lives might end in a fiery instant. But slowly, minute by minute, the rumbling beneath the deck began to fade. The vibrations that had shaken the ship subsided. The smoke thinned, and the terrifying thunder that had threatened to tear the battleship apart ceased altogether. When the last echo of the explosion died away, South Dakota was once again still, afloat, and intact. It had been unimaginably close seconds, perhaps, from becoming another flaming wreck on the vast Pacific. Yet she had survived. Gradually, as order returned, the crew resumed their stations. The ship's doctors and stretcher parties moved in to aid the wounded, and engineers began to inspect the damage. Once again, the great battleship's disciplined routine took hold, but no one could shake the grim realization of how narrowly they had escaped annihilation. When calm had finally returned, Captain Swede-Momsen stood on the bridge in thoughtful silence, his mind already turning toward the cause of the disaster. To him, it was unthinkable that a simple reloading operation, something done thousands of times across the fleet, could bring a ship of such power to the brink of destruction. 3 men were already dead, 8 more fatally wounded, and another 24 injured by fire and concussion. He felt a deep, personal responsibility to understand what had gone wrong and to make sure it would never happen again. Momsen's background as both an engineer and an inventor now guided his thinking. He knew the propellant used in the big gun's nitrocellulose powder was highly volatile, capable of igniting under the right conditions. Yet the silk bags that held the powder were believed to be perfectly safe. They were designed to eliminate the risk of sparks or friction. Likewise, the stainless steel canisters used to transport the bags were thought to be inert mere containers, 16 inches wide, a foot long, opened and discarded once the propellant was hoisted to the turret. Still, something about that process nagged at Momsen's mind. He imagined the scene below deck in those last minutes before the explosion, sailors lifting the heavy metal canisters, passing them hand to hand, sliding them across steel decks, and pulling the silk bags from inside. Could there have been enough friction to create a spark? Could static electricity, something so invisible and so ordinary, have caused the disaster? Momsen's scientific instincts told him it was possible. He had spent years studying gases, pressure and chemistry in his submarine research, and he knew how unpredictable static charges could be in confined spaces. The thought took hold of him, and he began drafting his official report that very night. He laid out his theory in precise detail. The transport of canisters might have caused the silk bags to shift inside, generating friction and consequently, a static charge strong enough to ignite the volatile nitrocellulose powder. But a theory alone was not enough. Momsen knew the Navy's bureaucracy well, especially the Bureau of Ordnance, BORD, which was notorious for dismissing inconvenient ideas. Determined to find proof, he began inquiring whether similar accidents had occurred aboard other battleships. He quickly ruled out destroyers and cruisers, since they used brass cartridges rather than silk powder bags. His focus stayed squarely on the capital ships, those massive floating fortresses that depended on powder bags for their heavy guns. If it had happened once, it could happen again, and that thought filled him with dread. By late May, Admiral Lee had been reassigned to the East Coast to investigate defenses against the growing kamikaze threat, leaving Momsen to await a response from BORD. When it came, it was everything he expected and dreaded. The Bureau flatly rejected his theory, calling it impossible. Their report was curt and dismissive. Thousands of powder bags have been used throughout the fleet for years without a single incident of spontaneous ignition. It is impossible for a spark to be generated within the canisters, and even if it were, it could not cause an explosion. In short, they accused Momsen of overreacting or worse, of being delusional. But Swede-Momsen was not a man easily discouraged. He had faced BORD's arrogance before during the Mark 14 torpedo crisis earlier in the war, when he had helped expose the Navy's faulty torpedo detonators despite fierce resistance from the same bureaucrats. That experience had earned him few friends within the Bureau, but it had given him a reputation for persistence and courage. Now, 18 months later, he found himself once again in their crosshairs. Yet he refused to yield. He began rallying support from other officers, men who respected his judgment and had witnessed his brilliance firsthand. Through persistence and influence, Mommsen managed to gain the attention of the highest authority in the Navy, Admiral Ernest J. King, the formidable chief of naval operations. With King's backing, Board had no choice but to conduct a formal series of experiments to test Mommsen's theory. At the Pearl Harbor Ammunition Depot, engineers and ordnance experts began a month-long set of tests. They recreated the conditions aboard South Dakota, moving and handling the canisters as sailors would during reloading operations. For weeks, the results seemed to favor Board's confidence. No sparks, no ignition, no evidence of static electricity. The Bureau's officials grew smug, convinced that Mommsen's wild idea was about to collapse under scrutiny. Then, on the final day of testing, fate intervened. During one last trial conducted under conditions that perfectly matched those in a battleship's magazine, a single canister was passed from one handler to another, exactly as it would have been during reloading. Suddenly, without warning, a spark leapt within the canister, and the test powder ignited with a flash. It happened precisely as Mommsen had predicted. The stunned observers could only stare as smoke curled from the test chamber. Board had no choice but to concede. Mommsen had been right all along. The investigation confirmed that friction between the silk powder bags and the metal canister could, indeed, generate enough static electricity to ignite the propellant. The discovery sent shockwaves through the Navy. Every battleship was, in effect, a potential powder keg, and it had taken Mommsen's relentless persistence to expose the truth. His victory was not one of pride, but of grim satisfaction. He had saved countless lives by proving a danger that others refused to see. The legend of Swede Mommsen, the inventor, the submariner, and now the savior of South Dakota, was sealed forever in the annals of naval history. The temptation to say, "I told you so," must have burned deep within Captain Charles Swede Mommsen, but such vanity was foreign to his character. He had always been a man of quiet determination, the kind who measured success not in vindication, but in lives saved and dangers prevented. Having finally proven his theory about the powder canisters and static ignition correct, Mommsen did not seek glory or recognition. Instead, he simply returned to his duties with renewed resolve, knowing that his persistence had prevented countless future tragedies at sea. His discovery led to changes in ammunition handling protocols, saving ships and sailors from the silent, invisible killer that had lurked in every battleship magazine. Yet even with these lessons learned, the specter of explosions would haunt the U.S. Navy decades later. The most infamous incident occurred in April 1989 aboard the USS Iowa, when an explosion tore through her No. 2 turret during a gunnery exercise. The Navy's first investigation hastily blamed a supposed act of sabotage by a sailor, suggesting he had deliberately triggered the blast. But a second independent investigation revealed the real causes: poorly trained turret crews and dangerously aged gunpowder from the 1930s, long past its shelf life. Those powder bags, stored for decades under improper conditions, had become highly unstable, the very kind of risk that Mommsen had warned about years earlier. One can't help but imagine that, had Swede Mommsen still been alive, he would have recognized the root cause immediately and perhaps prevented the tragedy altogether. As for the USS South Dakota, her own narrow brush with annihilation during the Okinawa campaign had left scars that required attention. She was sent to Ulithi Atoll for repairs, entering the massive floating dry dock ABSD-3. Inspectors discovered pitting and damage along her propeller shafts and screws, which required replacement and meticulous refitting. By May 27, repairs were complete, and the ship was once again seaworthy. She soon returned to active duty, first for anti-aircraft and anti-submarine training, before rejoining the mighty Task Group 38.1 under Rear Admiral John F. Shafroth. This phase of training was no mere formality. With the planned invasion of Kyushu approaching, South Dakota's gunners prepared for the most intense kamikaze onslaughts yet to come. Alongside her sister ships Indiana and Massachusetts, as well as heavy cruisers and destroyer escorts, South Dakota joined the bombardment of the Kamaishi steelworks on Kyushu, a strategic blow to Japan's industrial capacity. The task group then switched roles, providing anti-aircraft support for carrier-based airstrikes pounding Honshu and Hokkaido. In the final weeks of the war, she even fought side by side with the Royal Navy, including the veteran battleship HMS King George V, raining shells upon Tokyo's industrial and naval targets. Several Japanese ships and smaller craft were destroyed in these final bombardments, acts that symbolized the fading strength of the once mighty Imperial Japanese Navy. Then, on August 15, 1945, came the radio message that changed everything. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. On August 27, South Dakota entered Tokyo Bay, her steel hull gliding through the same waters that had once bristled with the enemy's might. She hosted Admirals William Halsey and Chester Nimitz, the commanding figures of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz used her as his base of operations until the morning of September 2, when he stepped aboard the USS Missouri to witness Japan's formal surrender. South Dakota, the hard-working and oft unlucky battleship, had survived the entire war to see peace restored, a witness to both its horrors and its triumphs. In the weeks that followed, South Dakota remained in service as Admiral Halsey's flagship while he coordinated with General Douglas MacArthur in dismantling what remained of Japan's naval power. Afterward, the ship joined the great procession of warships bound for Okinawa, then Pearl Harbor, before finally reaching San Francisco on October 27, Navy Day. There, Governor Earl Warren himself came aboard to celebrate the end of the war and the battleship's long service. Her post-war career was brief. After transiting the Panama Canal, South Dakota arrived at the Philadelphia Navy Yard in January 1946. For nearly a year, she served as flagship of the short-lived Fourth Fleet, before being decommissioned on January 30, 1947, and laid up in the Atlantic Reserve Fleet. Over the next decade and a half, the Navy considered modernizing her to carry Talos-guided missiles, but the cost of refitting such massive warships proved prohibitive. In February 1962, she was officially struck from the Navy Register, her proud name retired. Later that year, South Dakota was towed to New Jersey and scrapped. It was an unceremonious end for a ship that had fought across the vast Pacific, survived near destruction, and helped bring about victory. Almost exactly 20 years after her first battle at Guadalcanal, the USS South Dakota was gone but not forgotten. Her anchor and bell were preserved and sent to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where they became part of a memorial honoring the ship and her crew. A low concrete wall outlines the full-scale silhouette of the battleship, with mock-ups of her superstructure and a forward turret standing as silent sentinels to her legacy. While South Dakota may not have been the most celebrated or flawless battleship of World War II, she was undoubtedly one of the most steadfast. Through bad luck and good, disaster and triumph, she served with courage and resilience. Her story and that of her remarkable captain, Swede Mommsen, remains a powerful testament to duty, perseverance, and the human spirit that endures even when steel and fire falter.